Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we answer more questions from our community and touch on topics from Hitler to the Merchant Navy. Hi Jesse, here we are again, another week, another podcast. As I've just said, we are returning to some of the questions that our listeners have been asking us over the last few weeks. We can see there's a growing engagement, and particularly in our war room, where we have the exclusive content and people can engage with one another. And we have got a number of questions from this. So, where do we go with this? Where do we start? What do you think is a good way to open this one up?
Oh, it's a good question. I don't know. Why don't we start with Hitler? He's a very prominent figure, to say the least, in the war. And we had a question from Rebecca. And Rebecca asked us, how did Hitler go from Austrian? Of course, famously, he's from Austria, right? And grew up in a little town called Braunau am Inn in Upper Austria. How did he go from Austrian to German? He serves in the German army, after all, in the First World War, and then he becomes Chancellor of Germany. So what's the deal? How does he go from Austrian to German?
Well, that really is an interesting and fascinating question and topic, I have to say. So I really like this one. And the Austrians have been very clever, I have to say. And Jesse, I'll include you in this now because, well, dear listeners, you might know that Jesse, of course, lives in Vienna. And what he speaks is absolute flawless. I wouldn't even say German because it's Austrian. He's got a very Austrian. He's got a very strong Austrian influx of words and accents. It's quite funny. Not only do you have the kind of the German-Canadian divide, we also have an inner German, you might say, north-south divide, with me being Prussian through and through, and here we've got the Austrian. So maybe we should refight the 7 Years' War or something like this at some
that
stage.
would be exciting.
That would be interesting.
Not anyway, 1866 anyhow, for sure. But
anyway, so why I'm saying this, because the Austrians actually have been very, very clever at this, haven't they? So, because the entire world believes that Hitler is German when actually was Austrian. Probably 95% of the world also believes that Beethoven was Austrian when he was German. So you can see, pick and choose and do it wisely. So the Austrians are doing a much better job at this than the Germans. So how does all this happen? How does all this work? So of course, Hitler, when he's born in Braunau am Inn, which is the border town between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, i.e. Bavaria at that stage. So he is Austrian. He is Austrian through and through. He's got nothing to do, on paper at least, with German. There is no ancestry, there's nothing. Of course, from an early day, if you believe what he says in Mein Kampf, for example, he rejected the idea of Austria-Hungary because that's not a nation state, that's not German. You've got all sorts of, he would have said it, well, funny minorities in there, and all these Slavs and Hungarians and Jews, and I don't want anything to do with that. So he sees himself and regards himself very much as German. Now, the interesting thing is what you find in Austria in those days, and basically it goes all the way through, you might probably say the 1950s and 60s, is this idea of what is Austria? Where does Austria belong? And Jesse, you mentioned 1866. This is all to do with this whole idea of who is the dominant force in the German-speaking world. And in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you do have a bit of a drive at that time. It's very complex, so I'm keeping it very simple, of the German speakers, so modern-day Austria, to, of course, be the leader in this very interesting conglomerate of nations, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or alternatively, find some sort of way of going together with Germany. It's very complex, it's very difficult. I'm cutting a very long story short. You move forward, for example, to the end of the First World War, and the Austro-Hungary is dissolved, and there's actually a vote, a plebiscite in Austria, modern-day Austria, and the overwhelming majority of the Austrians votes to become part of Germany, which is then not allowed and forbidden by the Allied powers. You have similar movements after this, which is interesting when you go to 1938, the Anschluss, when the Austrians say we were one of the first countries or the first country to be occupied by the Nazis. Yeah, once you start scratching the surface, and
pretty willingly. pretty
Yeah,
willingly.
so again, so the Austrians were very, very good at using and massaging history afterwards. But anyway, that's just the context. So there's a bit of a movement in Austria at that time to get closer to Germany in whatever shape or form. And Hitler fits into this idea quite nicely. So before the First World War, Hitler goes to Munich from Vienna, where he'd lived beforehand. And of course, the idea behind that is he wants to get away from Austria. He wants to be more German now. This is where he also then joins the army. Jesse, you've already said that in the First World War, he volunteers, fights with the German army, which is really interesting because technically that wouldn't have been possible. So he basically dodges service in Austria-Hungary. And so it's one of the reasons why he doesn't want to go back to Austria or Austria-Hungary even before the end of the First World War, because he knows, well, technically, he might even be thrown in prison because, well, he dodged the military service. And the Germans shouldn't have taken him on because he's not a German citizen, so he can't serve in the military. But it's 1914, so everything's a bit different, and everyone gets excited about joining. So he fights the war and on the German side. And then, of course, he goes back to Munich, not Vienna, after the war. And he is still an Austrian-Hungarian citizen. He's not German at all. And then he starts his political career. He starts the agitation. Of course, there's the beer hall putsch, 1923, all these things that are happening. And Hitler's really worried at this stage because as a non-German, he is now in the spotlight of the authorities. And whatever he does, the moment he misbehaves, he could actually be expelled and kicked out of Germany. When you look at his time in prison, German law was very clear at that time. If you send someone to prison who's not German, after his prison sentence, he has to leave the country. That didn't happen. So technically in 1923-24, Hitler should no longer have been in Germany. So he's really worried about this, that this would bring to an end his political ambition and career in Germany. So as a consequence, he sends a letter to the Austrian authorities in 1925 and says, I would like to be released and I would like to no longer be a member of the Austrian nation. And they say, yep, okay, that's fine. He gets a paper back on the 30th of April, 1925, and he's no longer an Austrian citizen. However, he's not German either. So basically, Hitler is a nobody. He doesn't have citizenship, which makes the whole thing even more confusing. And how do you continue now? How do you do political career? How do you do anything? And Hitler always said afterwards he refused to apply for German citizenship. He said, I don't have to do this because I've shown that I'm German through and through by having fought for Germany in the trenches for 4 years. He then also writes about some other people, said 200 to 300,000 Eastern European Jews and other criminals have been given German passports and I haven't. So you can see there's a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but nevertheless. So now the question is, he wants to have a political career. In order to have a political career, you need to have citizenship. How are you going to massage this? And now, in some ways, the German idea of citizenship and nationhood played in his favor. Because in those days, all the way to 1934, this is when the law gets changed. Up to this stage, you're not predominantly German when you hold a German passport. You are first of all Bavarian, Prussian, Württemberg, whatever area you come from. And with the nationality of this would then come as a second step German nationality. So your passport all the way up to them would actually say nationality Prussian or nationality Bavarian, not German. That only changes later on. So Hitler can now benefit from this because you have, first of all, in Munich, a relatively strong nationalist socialist movement. And you already have in the early 1930s a number of ministers, and they're trying to give him citizenship. That doesn't really work for all sorts of reasons, and people laugh about him and say, well, that's all very silly what you're trying to do here. This will never work and will never happen. However, what then happens is that in 1932, because Hitler wants to run for presidency, and this comes up in 1932, the election for the president, he needs to have a German passport. How do you do this? So there are a number of people in the state. It's a state of Braunschweig, Brunswick, very, very small, completely insignificant, but it's in this federal system seen as an independent part of this federal system, so a state. And the National Socialists are already more or less in power there at that particular time. So they look at what it is that we can do here. And in those days, if you had a civil service job, a civil service occupation, that immediately came with citizenship as well. So they're looking at what can we do here. So first of all, they're trying to get him a professorship at a university. the professors, well, they just laugh at him and say, well, you know what? How can you get your professorship? You don't have A levels. You haven't been to university. Go away. And in the end, they settle with a relatively minor job in the administration of the state of Brunswick. And Hitler officially becomes the representative of the state of Brunswick in Berlin. He does that job for about 7 or 8 months. On paper, in reality, he never shows up. He never goes to Brunswick. But because he's been given this job, this comes with Brunswick nationality, and that gives him German nationality. And because of that, from 1932 onwards, it's February of 1932, when he's made basically a German citizen, he can then claim to be German, and that runs all the way through. It's interesting that just before he comes to power, shortly before that, the Brunswick government actually starts an investigation because they say, well, you've been on our payroll, but you've never worked for us, so something doesn't seem to be going right. Which, of course, strangely enough, was stopped very, very quickly on the 30th of January 1933. Shocking. But he then still sends a letter, I think it's in February, in which to Brunswick, to the government, in which he resigns from his position as an official of a civil servant of the Brunswick government. So it is quite funny. So that tells you quite a bit. It's a very long-winded story to something that you might say should be more straightforward, but it is not. So again, if Hitler claims to be very, very German, well, first of all, he's Austrian. Secondly, he's Brunswick, and then he's German. There we are.
Those bureaucratic loopholes, man, they can really be exploited by people for all sorts of stuff sometimes. Just by the way, I won't expand on your answer because I think it was as more thorough than one I could give. If listeners out there, you're interested in Hitler's earlier years, when he lived in Vienna, when he developed a lot of his political ideas, and when he really became, let's say, these formative years, when he really hitched his cart, so to speak, to the pan-German nationalist idea that all German speakers are one people and should be in one country, and so on and so forth. There's a great book by a German historian called Brigitte Hamann. It's called Hitler's Wien, Hitler's Vienna. I think it's been translated into English. I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure it has been. I have the German copy. But it's a fascinating look at Vienna and Austrian politics at this time. So in the decade between 1900 and 1910, pretty much. And there's so much that happened during that time in Viennese politics that influenced Hitler later on. You have political messaging, symbolism, tactics, rhetoric that he then copies and uses afterwards in his career in Germany. Let's move on to the next question, which two of our supporters asked. Both Jules and Mark asked a general question that they'd like to know more about the significance of the merchant navy, also known as the merchant marine, in the war. This is a topic that admittedly hasn't gotten a lot of my attention over the years. I'm not a boat person. I'm a bit afraid of oceans and things like that, and boats, but the merchant navy really deserves more attention because, as they say, professionals talk about logistics, whereas amateurs talk about tactics or something along those lines. And the merchant navy on the Allied side is critical to the entire global effort. You could not have the war being waged in the way that it was without an absolutely Herculean historic effort on the part not only of those crews, but of shipbuilders and so on and so forth. So the merchant navy, if any of you out there are not familiar with the concept, these are the kind of non-combat ships. They're the ones bringing supplies or bringing troops to where they have to go. And you can't wage a war globally as the UK and the US did without relying completely on the merchant navy. So one cannot overstate its importance. If we look at a few numbers of who's involved and ships and things like that, I mean, the UK plays the Well, it's hard to say. The UK plays an extremely critical role. Of course, they have a massive civilian fleet of ships with the legacy of maritime commerce. There's about 200,000 merchant sailors on UK ships in 1939. And of course, then others joined during the war. About 29,000 are killed just from the UK alone on 4,700 ships that were sunk. So those are huge numbers. I mean, when we talk today about shipbuilding in Europe or even in the US, I mean, 4,700 sunk ships would take us about 100 years to replace at current rates of shipbuilding. So the scale is something that is far beyond today's reality. As far as the US is concerned, at their peak, they had 215,000 merchant marine sailors. They lost about 8,600 killed, so less than the British. Of course, the British are running the most difficult routes essentially across the North Atlantic for longer than the Americans are. The Americans lose about 730 ships. And to put these losses into context, for the US anyway, the merchant marine rate of death is very, very significantly higher than the rate of death in the Navy. So you have more chances of dying if you're on a cargo ship than if you're on an aircraft carrier or a destroyer or a battleship, which I think is not something that our kind of popular image of the war really incorporates, or it's not really present that much. This whole system is professionalized. There's scientific ways of calculating, how to get an optimal amount of cargo onto a ship, how you load it, how you package it. There's even a merchant marine academy in the US that's created in 1943 to train officers to serve on these ships. And then, of course, there's the very impressive shipbuilding program. Just one model, just the most famous model, the Liberty ships, right, which is a British design, but then taken over and really made into something on a mass scale by the US shipbuilding companies. They built 2,700 of this one model of ship. And again, nowadays, I think the US builds like maybe a dozen ships a year maximum. I saw the stats a few weeks ago, but I can't remember exactly. It's unbelievable. And as far as Canada is concerned, Canada also played a fairly significant role given its limited size. The Canadian merchant marine in terms of ships grows by a factor of 10 during the war to about 410 ships. About 12,000 Canadian merchant seamen serve on those ships, and about 1,500 die. So that's more than 1 in 10 Canadian merchant sailors is killed during the war. That's wild. That's a casualty rate that should get more attention. So, Jules and Mark, I know that wasn't a comprehensive, history of the merchant navy, because I don't know the comprehensive history of the merchant navy. I don't want to put on airs here, but I thought that in some of those numbers, we can bring across the importance, and it should get more attention, including ours. And I've added it to a wish list for potential future episodes.
I think it's absolutely right. And every time we have mentioned the Merchant Navy so far in our series, I think I always say the same thing. To me, they are the unsung heroes of that war. You've just given the numbers. You've talked about the casualty rates. It's really something. It's really, really stark. And I think in one of the other episodes on questions, when we answered questions, we're talking about casualties, first of all, again, put that into context. But also we were talking about what is life like on the front line if you're not in a major battle. And so I said it's 90% boredom and 10% fighting and horror. This is very different when you're in a ship, particularly when you're in the Merchant Navy, because you're constantly going out on these convoys, aren't you? And that means you're constantly out there in the I want to say firing line, the torpedo line. So, and that is, it's not a nice place to be. Particularly think about the hardships of, you mentioned them, these convoys going through the North Sea in the middle of winter all the way to Murmansk and other places. I mean, I know where I'd rather be, and that's not necessarily in the Merchant Navy, to be perfectly honest. So, I tip my hat to all these people who served in that. It's not even a service, really, is it? But branch or on these ships, let's call it that way. That's absolutely right. Right, let's move on. So what else do we have? We've got lots of other questions. I've got one here from Richard, and it says simply, Maginot Line, ... why? Function, why did it fail? What happened to its defenders? A very short, succinct question, but again, a very, very, very long answer to this, potentially. So let's see if we can rein ourselves in, or whether we get carried away as always.
Grab your snacks.
Exactly. I don't know how many rabbit holes we find this time around, but there we are. So the Maginot Line, this is such a huge topic again, because you can move to the left all the way to probably the 16th, 17th century if you wanted to, talking about fortifications. But let's not go there, because otherwise this is going to be a bit much. I keep it very simple all the way up to the 1920s, 1930s, when the Maginot Line actually takes shape. So up to this stage, the experience of France in the war with Germany is very much, it's either an offensive war, you're trying to reach the Rhine line, or you're getting invaded by the Germans. Where do you normally get invaded? It tends to be the lower part of the border, so of the border between these two countries. So somewhere from the northern tip of Switzerland to the Ardennes region. This is why, for example, Alsace-Lorraine are so important to both countries, because you have fortresses there that can block the enemy's advance. You go into the First World War, you've got the fortress of Belfort, which doesn't see a lot of action, but it's very important in the French planning, so that's the very south. You have, of course, the big fortress at Verdun, which becomes extremely important, and in many ways, you might say, the symbol of the First World War. Say the First World War comes to an end, and the Germans can't really think about a lot of offensive warfare at this stage, or any warfare, because they're very much restricted by the Versailles Treaty. That, of course, is different on the French side. So the French are already thinking ahead, and they're saying, what is going to happen the next time war breaks out between Germany and France? Because everybody expects that at some stage something will happen again. As Marshal Foch, the French general, said in 1919, well, this is not a peace treaty, this is an armistice for 20 years. How right he was. So you can see they're already thinking ahead. How can you fight the next war? And a number of factors come together now. So the first factor is, of course, that the First World War is a war that France won, together with the Allies. So if that's a war you can win, and you have shown that you can win this war, why not fight a war along similar terms next time around? You don't really have to come up with something new. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just do what you've done before, and that's going to win. That means you're going to fight a defensive war, let the Germans attack, because the attackers will suffer more casualties. You weaken the enemy, you bleed the enemy white, as the term was at that time. Once they've done that, you've mobilized the world's resources. The merchant navy plays an important role here, getting resources from America, from colonies, all that stuff. And then you launch the big counterattack and you defeat the Germans. So if you sit in your fortifications and let the Germans attack, they will suffer even more casualties. So that's a bonus. Tick, that's a good idea. So let's have some sort of fortifications. The second reason why they think it's a good idea is the situation in France at that time. France has suffered a very high percentage loss of its male population, and everybody thinks, well, we can't go through this again. So when you just look at the percentage that they lose, it's about twice as high as Britain and about twice as high as Germany. So they lose a lot of men in the First World War. So they say, okay, if we sit behind this fortification again, we let the Germans attack, they suffer more casualties, and we are protected. So this is all working in France's favor. So this is a really, really good idea. Why would you not do this? Also, they say the German army, if Germany is able to mobilize again, is going to be much, much bigger, because statistically speaking, roughly, for one Frenchman, you've got two Germans. So the army is going to be bigger. So again, if you can use fortifications to enhance your defense, that's a very, very good idea. So why not build something like this? It's good for national psyche. It's good for the military. It's going to win you the war and the battle. So these are all very, very good ideas. Jesse, I know you've got, I wouldn't say a French thing going on, but just because of your language skills and your experience in France, what have I forgotten talking about the French and the French side?
I mean, not much. That's the idea, right? They know that they're not going to start the next war. It's not in France's interest to start the next war with Germany against a more powerful enemy. Germany still has its industrial base intact after the First World War. Of course, they have economic difficulties, but they can revive that industrial base for military purposes, which they do, starting from the at the latest, let's say mid 1930s. And not only did France lose proportionally more men than the Germans, they also have a lower birth rate anyway and an older population. So the pool that they're going to be able to draw from for a future war is even smaller. And Germany has even more of an advantage. So it makes sense to do that. Nobody knows that there's going to be such a thing as quote unquote blitzkrieg, or that tanks with air power are going to be able to overcome defenses at the speed that they eventually do. People expect nearly everywhere the conventional wisdom, not only the French. So it's not only the French that have these ideas, right? They expect the next war will be a kind of upscaled version with a long, grinding, attritional element to it. So it makes sense. I mean, even Maginot himself, André Maginot, was the Minister of Defense. He fought in the First World War and was badly wounded. So everyone is looking towards a solution that will allow them to minimize their own casualties. That's the thing. The watchword, I forget who said this. It might have been Pétain or it was Maginot. Anyway, folks, you can Google it out there. We want to be stingy with blood and lavish with steel. They might have said steel and concrete. But anyway, so that's the thinking behind it. Interestingly, there is an argument that it kind of worked when the time comes in 1940. I don't know. Do you have more on the Maginot Line? Is there another?
I've got a few things to go through. We also have to understand that the Maginot Line was not the only thing that the French had. Everyone always concentrates on the Maginot Line, mainly because you already mentioned the magic word, 1940. Did it work? Did it not work? We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what everybody looks at. And quite often people say because they invested all this money in the Maginot Line and also it channeled their thinking, this is why 1940 failed on the French side. I think this is too harsh because you always have to see the Maginot Line together with the other thing, the other bits they were thinking about. So you've got the Maginot Line stretching all the way from the Swiss border to the Ardennes forest. And that's, of course, where the Germans then attack in 1940. Dear listeners, if you haven't listened to that, there's a podcast in our series on France 1940 as well. So that's the weak spot that the Germans identify. But to the French, the more important bit in many ways is then the northern bit. And this is the border with Belgium. So first of all, the French said we can't really extend the Maginot Line all the way into Belgium. First of all, it's getting to the Belgian border. It's getting too expensive. It sends out a wrong political signal. We're writing off Belgium as well, should something happen again. But also, and this is for the French the most important thing, they just basically wanted to channel the German advance. They wanted to make sure that either the Germans run like a bull against the French defensive line and have lots of casualties, or you want to channel the German attack that they would do exactly the same thing what they'd done in 1914. Again, it worked for the French in 1914. Why not do the same? And if you can now predict where the Germans are coming from, the moment war breaks out, rather than staying put where you are as the French and let the Germans invade French territory, you would march into Belgium, which is highly industrialized at the time, very, very important for the war effort. And a nice side effect for the French this time around, you're not fighting on French soil, but you're only fighting on Belgian soil. So you always have to see these two things in combination. It's the static defense down the south with the operational defense, or strategic defense operationally conducted in a more offensive way going into Belgium. And that's the two parts of this. And quite often the second part, the operational offensive, is not really seen. And that sometimes sends out the wrong picture when you look at the Maginot Line, because it's also what they pour into this. Quite literally so, when you look at the concrete, is a lot. So it starts in 1930, and the whole thing is then built by the Service Technique du Génie. And there's an organization, of course, there's a commission d'organisation de régions fortifiées, so regions and fortified regions. The commission for that is working at this, looking at this, and they spent 3 billion French francs on the whole thing. This, by 1930 standards, because it starts in 1930, is a lot of money. So that really is a lot. And some people have said if they'd invested that money somewhere else, in modern tanks or what have you,
in their Air Force.
Or the Air Force, for example, the army or the military would have fared much better in 1940. I'm not quite sure that is true. But when you look at the amount of things and stuff that they built, so because we say it's a line, so sometimes people still have this idea in their heads that there's some sort of trench line, a few bunkers and dugouts, very, very thin, no depth to it at all. This is completely wrong. So it's a zone which sometimes is up to 20 kilometers deep, 10 to 20 kilometers. So it's a deep, deep zone of defense. And when you look at what they're putting there, so you have along this entire line, you've got 45 grand ouvrages, so that's main forts, the big ones, the really big ones, and they normally sit at an interval of, roughly speaking, 15 kilometers, which means they can support each other with heavy artillery, for example. You've got 97 smaller forts, you've got 352 casemates, and these have over 100 kilometers of tunnels. So this is a very, very sophisticated, very clever system. And dear listeners, should you ever go to this part of the world, you can still visit a number of them. It's absolutely fascinating to see how much ingenuity went into all of these. So that's the interesting bit. Of course, what happens then in 1940 is that they are outmaneuvered to a large degree because the Germans go through the Ardennes. And let's not revisit the podcast we already did. But the Germans still have an entire army group C, which sits opposite the Maginot Line. So the French are fixing German force and the Germans are fixing French forces, you might say. Quite often you hear, well, these troops, they weren't good anyway because they're all second-rate and they're all old. There is that, so you have a large proportion of relatively old reservists manning these positions. However, you also have a lot of specialists. So, for example, engineers, and in particular also men from the artillery, because these forts are quite artillery heavy. So it's an interesting mix of people that you get there. And in the end, cut a very, very long story short, of course, when the Germans managed to break through in the west, then you've got Dunkirk and all these things, the end of Fall Gelb, Operation Yellow, when the Germans then regroup and it goes to Case Red, this is where they basically managed to attack these forts and positions, mainly from the rear. And so I'm cutting a very long and much more complex and complicated story a bit short. It is relatively easy for the Germans to overcome them. But if should you ever go to this part of the world and visit some of these, they will tell you the story of some of these forts. And you will see in some of these, there was actually quite some heavy fighting. And the Germans had a lot of respect for the troops that were fighting in these very, very sophisticated and elaborate defensive positions. So we have a tendency to write off everything to do with concrete, which is probably true. But if the French plan had worked well, concrete in the south, mobile troops in the north, then it might have been a very different story. So these have to be seen together, these two parts of the French defense plan.
I think this is one of the paradoxes, in a way, in intelligence, but also in military history, is that you can have a sound plan that doesn't work out. And we shouldn't say that the plan was completely foolish just because it doesn't work out. And I think this is one of those cases. There are weaknesses to the French approach to war and so on, but it's not as simple as, it was stupid to build that and it was doomed to failure and so on and so forth. It also had a bit of a psychological impact, though, on the French, because in theory, they had an opportunity when the German army is mostly in Poland in fall 1939. They had an opportunity to do something. They could have mounted an offensive and gone into Western Germany, and there was very little to stop them. And German commanders, some of them were quite concerned about this possibility. But if you invest your entire thinking and budget into a huge network of static fortifications, it creates a psychological barrier for you to then do something not based on that plan. And that is part of why France was not more aggressive in the fall of 1939. They kind of, in a way, became a prisoner of their own doctrinal thinking based on a defensive war. In any case, I'm glad that question was asked and answered, because I think the Maginot Line is always worth a second look beyond the memes and comments online that we often see. So I will take another question, I think, that we had from Simon. And Simon asked us, what are your favorite World War II documentaries? He mentions in that comment, he goes on to mention that he really likes a Holocaust documentary called Shoah by Landsmann, which I have not yet seen. And of course, he's a fan of the all-time classic, the BBC's World at War documentary. I'm just going to pick two that I thought were interesting that I know of. One of them's German, one of them's Canadian. The German one that has stuck with me, I randomly came across it on YouTube, I think illegally. So I don't recommend breaking copyright laws, let's just say, but I do think that it can be found in its entirety on YouTube. It's a documentary from 1990 called Mein Krieg in German and My Private War in English. I may have even mentioned it on the podcast before because I liked it so much and I found it so impactful on me. In any case, it won awards at the Berlinale Film Festival at the time. Basically, it's about 6 German World War II veterans. They play different roles. Some were young conscripts, some served longer during the war. They come from different parts of the country and so on. One thing that they all have in common is that they all were amateur film enthusiasts at the time. So each of those 6 German soldiers recorded their own private film footage of their experiences on different fronts, different periods of the war, different branches of the service. And the documentary consists basically of the footage that they privately recorded and them being interviewed by the documentary makers, telling their stories about their lives after the war, about their experiences during the war. And it's such a powerful human story. Of course, the images are extremely interesting. They're very, I don't know, they're of course, you're at the level of a regular soldier. So it's not propaganda footage and so on. For that reason alone, the visuals are extremely interesting. But of course, the human story really, is what affects you because you have these different Germans who have different wartime experiences and especially different memories about it, and they deal with it in different ways. It runs the gamut, so to speak. You have one guy who ended up finishing the war in the Kurland pocket in Eastern Europe where they're cut off and there's just absolutely desperate fighting for months, having been cut off from the rest of German forces. And the filmmakers, this is especially important around this period, early 1990s, late 1980s, Germany dealing with, you have this generation that's still alive that's involved in World War II and war crimes and so on. So trying to bring that up as a topic more than they would have had that documentary been made in the 50s or what have you. So they ask, do you feel a sense of responsibility or guilt or anything along those lines? And you have this one guy from the Kurland pocket. I think he was actually an officer. You can tell he gets agitated. He doesn't like this question. He gets a little bit angry. And he says, I didn't do anything wrong. And I have a crystal, this is the word he uses in German, kristallklares Gewissen. So I have a crystal clear conscience. And he straightens up and everything when he's saying it. So you really see that defiance, that refusal, to acknowledge what happened or one's connection to what happened in some way. Then you have another guy who's the owner of a music box shop. Now, these aren't common toys anymore. And so you have these scenes where he's explaining, after the war, I wanted a quiet life. It was very difficult. And I opened up this toy shop and they have little carousels and they make music. And you see him showing the camera, like, I really like this one. And he opens it and there's a little childlike music and you see his face. He's like very enthusiastic about his job. And he says, what I like most about my job, about owning this little toy shop, is the faces of the kids when they hear the music, when the box is opened up. And then you have the interview with him in the studio where they ask him about war crimes. And this same guy says, well, yes, I heard about that when I was on the Eastern Front, but, I wasn't involved. And they say, well, how did you hear about it? What was and, they're edging with more detail in their questions. And then he says, Well, I heard it happen. I heard them shooting Soviet civilians. I heard the gunshots. And then, they creep forward with the questions, and it turns out he was one of the ones doing the shooting. And he breaks down on camera and he's crying and so on with remorse. It's such a powerful part of that human contradiction. And then you have a soldier who was very young who says, I didn't see anything. Yes, there was fighting. I didn't see any Soviet civilians being killed. I didn't see any concentration camps. But I am responsible. And I feel guilt. I feel that I was a part of this and I am responsible for it. And this kind of is a weight that I carry in my life. So you see, things running the full gamut of the human experience. And that's one of my favorite all-time documentaries. Have you got a favorite?
It is interesting because we looked at some of these questions before we started recording, you listeners, but we didn't really talk about the content at all. And so I just wrote down, I'll ask you 2 documentaries, and strangely enough, exactly the ones that you've mentioned. So the ones you just talked about and World of War are there as well. So there we are. So they must be good if the 2 of us mentioned them. There are lots of documentaries out there. I mean, Jesse, you've been working on these things. Well, I've been doing recording, so there's tons of stuff out there. Some, as you've just explained, probably better than others, more insightful, more revealing, more whatever the right word is. But the more you watch, the better it is, probably. I mean, there's another one that I really like. It's not so much the documentary series itself, which I think is sometimes a bit lame. And this it started, I think, in the 1990s, a German one. And there was this German, basically a popular historian, it's called Guido Knopp. And he made a lot of documentaries on telly. And Jesse's already shaking his head. I can see it. And I've got exactly the same approach to the documentaries themselves, because he started off quite well, but then he got carried away. And you've got Hitler's armies, Hitler's generals, Hitler's dogs, Hitler's women, Hitler's tailors, Hitler's I don't know what. There's all Hitler's everything. And it gets too much, I find personally. And most of it is quite basic. However, within all of this, there was a larger research project that the German television at that time ran, and that's where this guy gets most of his first-hand accounts from as well. And they went around interviewing lots of veterans. They just sit them down in front of a black screen, and they just let them talk about whatever. So mainly, of course, war stuff on the Eastern Front, Western Front, and there is so much material out there. It's also, for example, on YouTube. If you want to see some of these interviews, of course, it's all in German. But again, it comes back, Jesse, to your point that you just mentioned about these interviews and the raw side and getting these emotions out from people. So that's why I think not so much the Guido Knopp documentaries themselves, but the wider research project around that I find absolutely fascinating for exactly the reason you just mentioned.
Right. And I'll mention one more, and then I feel like this episode may have run its course for us today. But in any case, the other documentary I want to mention, it's a little niche because it's a Canadian production and it focuses on Canadian topics in the Second World War. But there are other examples of similar impact in other countries. Documentaries can have a big impact on how people think about history, and they can influence political fights about history and what should be remembered and how. So they are quite a significant medium. And obviously I'm biased. I'm in the business of making history documentaries. So of course I want to feel that they're important, but they do play a certain role. And there was a documentary made in 1992 in Canada called The Valor and the Horror. And it's a 3-part documentary made by some prominent journalists. And it has 3 parts. One focuses on the Japanese conquest of Hong Kong. And there was a Canadian unit stationed there at the time. One focuses on the bombing campaign against Germany. And of course, the Royal Canadian Air Force played a role in that. And one focuses on the Normandy campaign. And this documentary it took a particular narrative line. So it had a particular emphasis. And it wanted to be an anti-war documentary, which is fair enough. It's easy there's a lot of material if you want to make an anti-war documentary because war is terrible. So they want to, show the brutality of war. They don't want to sugarcoat things because it was Canadians or what have you. But nonetheless, it became quite controversial. They really emphasize command mistakes, especially in Normandy, the callousness of some officers, the war crime discussion around the strategic bombing campaign, morale issues in the Canadian forces, especially in Northwest Europe, and the occasional brutality of Canadian troops as well, as all armies have in war. So it's not that none of those things existed. It's not like they, invented stuff, but, they made a couple of, I think, mistakes as far as history goes. So they cherry picked some things to emphasize their points. They didn't deal with other the weight of other historical evidence that would have balanced out their narrative, right? So usually in history, if you're trying to make an argument, you will have to deal with evidence that contradicts that argument, right? Otherwise, yours is going to be weaker. And they didn't do a very balanced or a very good job of that. They used Verrières Ridge in Normandy as an example. It was a failed local Canadian attempt to take this bit of high ground in Normandy. The Black Watch, famous Canadian unit, suffered terrible casualties, and they emphasized, how incompetent it was, that there was a slaughter, and nobody was thinking about, whether it could go wrong and so on. It's just too much. It's just too exaggerated on that side. And it made a big impression on me, 12-year-old me at the time. People watched it. It was on national television. My grandfather hated it, as did most veterans, because they felt this isn't fair. It's not balanced, right? It wasn't just about the things that went wrong. It wasn't just about the times when Canadian troops or commanders were incompetent or cruel. And my grandfather said, it makes us out to be monsters, and we weren't. Now, that's a very emotional, personal reaction from him, but the documentary caused a lot of ink to be spilled, and a lot of it was very, very emotional, that it was too slanted. In trying to show the brutality of war, it kind of twisted the reality of war, let's say. So The Valor and the Horror, very controversial, very impactful documentary in Canada.
Well, I think you just made a very distinct point there when you say, well, obviously, and quite rightly so, people were outraged and say, well, this is unfair and this is not the war that we fought. And then previously we're talking about this German guy from the Kurland pocket who got very upset about this as well. So you could actually draw a parallel. Yes, there are differences because you're fighting for a different regime. You then talked about the shooting of civilians and all this. Of course, that happens. But if that person really had a crystal clear conscience, as he said, he would sit pretty much in the same category. Whereas, of course, the big difference here is also that, and that's a general point that might be worth exploring in far more detail, is when you look at all these things in source material, and you talked about how to construct historical arguments. Germany is probably the only country in the world that does not have any state secrets or anything all the way up to 1945, because all the archives were opened in 1945, and you still find millions of files in, particularly in the East now, in the Eastern archives. You also had them in Washington. But sometimes when you go to the German military archives and you want to get a German file, you get a photocopy because the original is still in Washington. So that still happens. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? Once you start breaking this down from the bigger picture level all the way to personal experience. And understandably, if you have, for good reasons, a crystal clear conscience, whether you can have it or not, but if you have that, they have to get upset by these things, which is a perfectly human reaction, I think. It's an interesting one, interesting parallels there.
Yes, the complexity of war. One of the reasons why we'll never run out of material for this podcast, especially listeners, if you keep the questions coming. I want to remind you that the supporters of the podcast get priority for question answering. So if you want to make sure that your question has the best possible chance of being answered on the air by Matthias and I, you can support our work here at the podcast at bothsidesofthewire.com. We also release exclusive content in our War Room that's only available to supporters, including some questions. In fact, we're going to answer a fairly sensitive question about Ukrainians and Poles and the ethnic cleansing that takes place there during the war as well. We're going to answer that in the war room. In any case, you can get a free trial in our members community at bothsidesofthewire.com by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So that was the episode for today. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
And here we go. Another one. Ta-da!
Voila.